So, you wanted us to really dig into transing our children, huh? Have to admit, we knew going in this was going to be a tough one.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation a lot of people are having, even if it's not always out in the open.
Exactly. And you're definitely not alone in wanting to understand, where the authors are coming from, what their arguments are.
And to be super clear right off the bat, our goal here is to lay it all out on the table, not to say we agree or disagree with Brewer and Keffler.
We're your investigative team. Think of us with our metaphorical magnifying glasses, notebooks, dissecting all the details.
Right, like we're about to do a deep dive into their claims and the evidence they use to back it all up, but we're doing it with neutral glasses on, okay?
You shared the book because you really want to get their perspective on what's become, let's face it, a really sensitive and often confusing topic.
And it's not like Brewer and Keffler are just like random people with opinions,
Yeah.
Brewer's got a PhD and Keffler has a master's in education.
Right. They're not just like armchair quarterbacks on this issue.
And they even got endorsements for the book from some pretty big names in medicine and psychology.
Which, honestly, when you think about how controversial some of the stuff in the book is, it makes you wonder a little, right?
It definitely adds another layer to the whole thing.
For sure. But I did appreciate that they used a lot of personal stories and anecdotes in the book.
Yeah, those definitely make it more, I guess, relatable than just reading a dry textbook.
Okay, so they jump right into this whole gender ideology thing, which they seem to see as very different from biological sex.
Yeah, they make a big deal about that distinction right from the get-go. Like, biological sex is about your body, right?
Yeah.
Chromosomes, hormones, all that.
The physical stuff.
Exactly. But gender ideology, at least how they define it, it's more about this idea that your gender is totally separate from your body.
And that's where they have a problem.
That's where things get interesting. They argue that this whole separation of gender and sex, it's not just some abstract idea, it's actually really important because it's at the root of so many of the debates and arguments happening around transgender issues today.
So how does that actually play out? Give me an example.
Well, they talk a lot about language, like the words we use. They point to the word cisgender, for example. They're basically saying that using that word to describe people who identify with the sex they were assigned at birth is a way to make it seem like, oh, that's just one option on a spectrum.
Instead of just being, normal.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
by calling it cisgender, you're kind of implying that it's unusual or even like a problem.
Interesting. So they're saying the words we use actually shape how we think about gender.
Totally. And they do the same thing with the phrase assigned at birth. They really pick that apart. They say it downplays the whole biological reality of sex.
Like it's not assigned, it just is.
Right. They spend a lot of time in the book breaking down how these subtle language shifts can really change how we view sex and gender.
And then they bring in this story about Aaron Brewer's own childhood.
Yeah, and this was back in the 60s, long before being transgender was really talked about openly.
So they're saying these feelings, they're not new.
Right. Brewer talks about how she struggled with gender dysphoria as a kid, but that the adults in her life encouraged her to, accept her biological sex.
What happened?
She says she eventually found peace with it, with who she was. And I think that challenges the narrative that if you don't affirm a kid's gender identity right away, they're doomed to be miserable.
Okay, so they're pushing back on that idea. Interesting.
And this all leads to what they say is like the big central claim of the book, that this whole ideology around transgender identities, at least as they define it, it's not just wrong, it's actually dangerous, especially for kids.
So we left off with this idea that they think this whole ideology is, like, dangerous, especially when it comes to kids. But where's the proof? How do they back that up?
Well, a lot of the book is dedicated to challenging some of the main arguments that are used to support, transitioning children.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so one of the big ones they tackle is this idea that if you don't let a child who's experiencing gender dysphoria transition, they're basically guaranteed to commit suicide.
Right, I've heard that a lot. It's like this really scary statistic gets thrown around.
Exactly. And they call this the suicide myth.
Suicide myth. Catchy.
Yeah.
But what's their take on it?
They really dig into the research, and they question if the studies that are often used to support this claim, if they're really looking at the whole picture.
Like, are they really accurate?
Well, they say that just because there's a correlation, like, yeah, some trans kids might have suicidal thoughts, doesn't mean that transitioning is the magic solution. They're saying there might be other things going on,
Like what?
mental health issues, problems at home, bullying, all that stuff. They argue those things could contribute to suicidal thoughts whether a kid transitions or not.
That makes sense. So it's more complicated than just let them transition and everything will be fine.
Way more complicated. And they have a bunch of evidence to support this, including some quotes from doctors and researchers who are, like, questioning this whole direct link between not transitioning and suicide.
So it's not just their opinion. They have other experts backing them up.
Yeah, like, they talk about this guy, Dr. Kenneth Zucker, who's done a lot of research on gender dysphoria in kids, and he suggests this whole watchful waiting approach.
Watchful waiting. What's that?
It's basically like, okay, we hear you, we see you're struggling, but let's not rush into anything. Let's provide therapy, support, and just see what happens as you go through puberty.
So instead of medical intervention right away, it's more about like giving kids the space to figure things out.
Exactly. And they say this often leads to the dysphoria just kind of resolving on its own.
Huh. So they're advocating for a more, I don't know, cautious approach, especially with kids who are still figuring out who they are.
Totally. And to support that, they look at the actual suicide rates among transgender people, and they argue that activists often use those statistics in a misleading way, like to fit their agenda.
So they're saying don't believe everything you hear.
Basically, yeah. And they even share this story about a doctor who actually told a kid to threaten suicide if they wanted to get hormones.
Whoa. Hold on. Seriously?
Yeah, it's a pretty intense anecdote, and it just shows how much pressure there is on kids to, like, do whatever it takes to transition, even if it means, go into extremes.
Really scary. Okay, so that's the suicide myth. What's next?
Well, and another argument they challenge is the idea that some kids who think they're transgender might actually just be gay.
Oh, wow. That's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. But they bring up this idea of homophobia and how in some families or communities, being gay is still really hard. So some kids might think, okay, if I transition, then it's okay. Then I'm not gay anymore.
So it's like they're choosing to be trans because it feels safer than being gay?
It's possible, right. And they give some examples of people who later detransitioned because they realized, wait a minute, this wasn't about gender. This is about me being gay, and I wasn't ready to face that.
Do they give any like specific examples?
Yeah, there's this one story about a parent who said they were actually relieved when their kid came out as trans because at least that meant, quote, they're not gay.
Wow. That's a lot to unpack, but it shows how complicated these issues are, right? Like there's so much societal pressure around both gender and sexuality.
Exactly. And it kind of makes you wonder, how many kids are struggling with this, feeling like they have to choose between being trans or being gay?
Okay, so we've got the suicide myth
Yeah.
and the idea that some trans kids might actually be gay.
Huh.
What else?
Well, this is where they get into some really controversial territories. They start talking about autogenophilia.
Auto what? I'm going to be honest, I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, and it's definitely a topic that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Basically, it's when men are sexually aroused by the idea of themselves as female.
Okay. And how does that relate to transgender identities?
Well, Brewer and Keffler are really careful to say that autogenophilia is not the same as being transgender. They see it as a totally different thing.
So why even bring it up then?
Their concern is that within the transgender movement, those lines are getting blurred, and they think that's really dangerous.
Dangerous how?
Well, they argue that if you don't acknowledge that autogenophilia exists, you might misinterpret why some people, specifically some men, want to transition.
Okay, I think I'm following. So they're not saying all trans women are motivated by this, but they're saying it's a factor that should at least be considered.
Exactly. And they even cite a statistic that 3% of men in Western countries might experience autogenophilia.
3%? That's more common than I would have thought.
And then they go on to analyze, like sissy hypno porn and how it relates to all of this.
Okay, hold up, sissy hypno porn. Now I'm really lost.
Basically, it's this type of porn that often features themes of forced feminization and humiliation. And Brewer and Keffler see it as evidence to support their argument about autogenophilia.
Okay, I'm going to need a minute to wrap my head around that one. But I think the bigger point here is that they're really concerned about the medicalization of gender dysphoria, right? Like
Oh.
all the puberty blockers and hormones and surgery.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge focus of the book. They think giving kids these treatments is super risky, especially because we don't really know the long-term effects yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, kids' bodies are still developing.
Exactly. And they list out all these potential side effects from hormones like blood clots, stroke, even problems with fertility. And then there's puberty blockers, which they say, yeah, they might pause puberty, but we don't know how that's going to affect bone density or brain development down the line.
So their whole argument is basically pump the brakes. We need to be careful here.
Pump the brakes is a good way to put it.
Yeah.
They think we're basically experimenting on kids without really understanding the consequences.
And they back this up with stories from people who've detransitioned, right?
Yeah.
Like people who regret transitioning.
Big time. They dedicate a whole section of the book to sharing those stories. People who felt pressured to transition, who weren't given all the information, and who now regret their decisions.
That's got to be tough.
It is. And they argue that a lot of times these detransitioners, they're silenced. Like their stories aren't told because they go against the narrative that transitioning is always a good thing.
So they're trying to give those people a voice.
Exactly. They want people to know that transitioning isn't always the answer, and sometimes it can actually cause more harm than good.
Okay, so that's a lot to digest. But I feel like we haven't even gotten to the part about schools yet.
Oh, right. That's a whole other can of worms. Basically, they're really concerned about how gender ideology is being taught in schools, especially without parents really knowing what's going on.
Okay, so like what exactly do they mean by gender ideology in schools? Can you give me some examples?
Sure. They talk about how even young kids are being taught about gender identity and expression as being totally separate from biological sex. And they say this is happening in classrooms, in school libraries, even in policies about things like bathrooms and pronouns.
So it's not just about like accepting kids who are different. They're saying it's way more than that.
Way more. And they're really critical of organizations like GLSN, the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network.
Yeah, I've heard of them. They do a lot of work around anti-bullying and LGBTQ inclusion, right?
Right. But Brewer and Keffler have a problem with some of their policies, like the ones that say schools shouldn't tell parents about a student's gender identity, even if the kid asks them not to.
Wow. So basically they're saying parents should know what's going on with their kids at school.
That's a big part of it, yeah. They believe parents have a right to be involved in these decisions, especially when it comes to something as personal and potentially life-altering as gender identity.
Okay, so we've spent a lot of time talking about what Brewer and Keffler are against. But what do they actually want to see happen? What's their solution?
Well, they're calling for, like, a major overhaul in how we approach gender dysphoria in kids. And it's not just about, like, tweaking things here and there. They want to see a fundamental shift in the whole conversation.
So what does that look like?
For starters, they want a total stop to medical interventions for minors. Like, no more puberty blockers, no cross-sex hormones, no surgeries, until we actually know what those treatments are going to do to kids in the long run.
They're saying put a pause on all of that.
A hard pause. They think it's irresponsible to keep going down this road when we don't have all the facts.
And it's not just about waiting for more research, right? They want us to think about this whole issue differently.
Totally. Like,
Yeah.
instead of just assuming that a kid's gender dysphoria means they need to transition, they're saying, hold on, let's look deeper. What else could be going on?
So not dismissing their feelings, but trying to understand where those feelings are coming from.
Exactly. Like, could it be mental health issues, family problems, social pressure? They want therapists to spend more time exploring those possibilities instead of just immediately affirming a kid's desire to transition.
It's like they're saying, let's help kids understand themselves, not just try to change their bodies.
Right. Help them learn how to cope with those feelings, how to accept themselves, even if it's not the quick fix that some people want.
It's a more holistic approach, right? Looking at the whole child, not just their gender identity.
Exactly. And they don't let society off the hook either. They say we need to create a world where it's okay to be different, where kids aren't pressured to fit into these rigid gender boxes.
So it's about tackling those societal expectations that tell boys they have to act one way and girls another way.
Absolutely. They say we've got to address homophobia too, because some kids might be struggling with their sexuality, but feeling like the only way to be accepted is to be trans.
It's about creating a world where kids feel safe and loved for who they are, no matter what.
Exactly. And they even offer some practical advice for people who want to make a difference.
Like what?
They really push parents to be involved in their kids' schools, to know what's being taught, what policies are in place, and if they don't like what they see, to speak up.
Don't be afraid to advocate for your kids.
Exactly. And they also say it's so important to find therapists who are really going to listen to kids, who aren't just pushing a certain agenda.
Therapists who are really focused on helping kids thrive, whatever that looks like for them.
Right. And they even provide a list of resources in the book for people who want to explore these alternative viewpoints. Organizations that are challenging the current approach, supporting families, offering different perspective.
It's like they're saying, hey, we're not the only ones questioning this. There's a whole community out there.
Exactly. And I think that's really important because this whole topic can feel so overwhelming and isolating.
For sure. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. This book, it's definitely sparked a lot of debate, and we're not expecting everyone to agree with everything Brewer and Keffler have to say.
Yeah. Not at all. But hopefully, you've gotten a better understanding of where they're coming from, what they're arguing, and the evidence they use to support their claims.
Because at the end of the day, knowledge is power, right? The more informed we are, the better equipped we are to navigate these complex issues.
Totally. And to make the best decisions for ourselves, for our families, for our communities.
And maybe that's a good place to leave it for today. A lot to think about.
Definitely. But one last thought before we go, because the authors leave us with a pretty heavy trigger. They ask, if some kids are struggling with gender dysphoria because of other issues, is it really ethical to just focus on affirming their gender identity without trying to get to the root of those other problems?
It's almost like they're saying, are we doing kids a disservice by not looking deeper?
Exactly. It's a question that kind of sticks with you.
For sure. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. As always, we encourage you to keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
We'll catch you next time.
Until then, take care of yourselves and keep those minds open.